Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do something a little bit different and fun and I think exciting. I want to talk about the 25 best books of the last 25 years. At the end of the video, I will pick a top 5 out of that 25 and then I will select what I think is the best book from the last 25 years, 1998 to present. I should note right off the bat, I am going to be talking about fiction books, novels, novellas, short story collections. Nonfiction is not going to factor into this list. This came about because after the death of Cormac McCarthy, I saw many people referencing a 2006 article from the New York Times. I'll have a link to it down below, in which the New York Times named Toni Morrison's Beloved as the best book published in the previous 25 years. And if you're wondering why that article was relevant for Cormac McCarthy, his 1985 novel Blood Meridian was one of 4 runners-up for the title. And Blood Meridian is a book that a lot of people latched onto and held up as sort of the definitive Cormac McCarthy book after his death. It's an interesting article to look at, but it's been 17 years since it was published. All of the top 5 books, including the other 3 runners-up, Don DeLillo's Underworld, John Updike's inexplicably lumped together Rabbit Angstrom novels, and I say inexplicably lumped together because, I get that it's a series, but at least half of those books were outside of the time period that the New York Times was supposed to be considering, so it's a weird thing that they did. But anyway, the 3rd book was Philip Roth's American Pastoral. All of those books and Blood Meridian and Beloved are outside of the last 25 years at this point. So I started to wonder, what would this list look like if it were made today? And if it was more of a proper list of like the 25 best. So I went back and selected my top 25 fiction books published from 1998 through today. I had to make some tough cuts along the way. Later on, I will talk about some books that were cut close to the end. And I'm also going to talk about some books in a moment that I have not read yet that might make it onto someone else's list, but I can't include them because I haven't read them. And I think it's important to just mention them because I know I can like feel a lot of people getting ready to jump in with a comment like, what about this book? And if I haven't read it, I can't consider it, so I'll just do a quick list of those in a moment. And I will also quickly talk about some books and authors that I don't really like enough, but which might appear on your list if you did this list, and that would be fine. I'm not going to make like a tag of this, but I will invite you, if you would like to do your own list. I would be very curious to see what would be on it. And if you don't have a channel, feel free to just leave your top 25 in the comment section down below. But if you would like to do your own video, please do it. And maybe just tag me, because I would be very curious to see what would make it onto your list. Before we begin, I want to make a quick note. I hope it's obvious, but I am a white dude living in the United States. I have started reading a lot more literature in translation over the recent years, but this list is going to reflect my very Western view of what constitutes great literature. The reality is that every book on this list was published in English, but I am pleased to see that it reflects a good range of diverse authors and stories within the English language. It's just not a very global list, and I acknowledge that this is a failing of mine, not of any global authors who frankly deserve better respect. I can only present my list as it stands and pledge to do better in the future if I ever decide to do another list like this again. I also tend not to read a lot of science fiction or fantasy, romance, or mystery. This list reflects my slant toward literary fiction. Even though I hate the term literary fiction, it remains the name for the category of literature that I read most often. So, for better or for worse, here we are. Now, let's quickly talk about some books that I have on my list to read, but I have not read yet, and they feel like big books that have been published over the last 25 years, and I just haven't read them yet. So I'm going to read through this list really quickly. I'm going to put timestamps down below. If you want to skip to a different section, feel free to do so. But here are the books that I have not read, so I cannot consider. The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga, Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, The Idiot by Elif Bauterman, The Sellout by Paul Beatty, Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks, Milkman by Anna Burns, True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey, Outline by Rachel Cusk, In the Distance by Hernan Diaz, Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman, The Gathering by Anne Enright, The Trees by Percival Everett, Tinkers by Paul Harding, A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, The Orphan Master's Son by Adam Johnson, The Known World by Edward P. Jones. I feel like that is a big one. Behold the Dreamers by Mbalo Mbue, Circe by Madeline Miller, Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, Lanny by Max Porter, Normal People by Sally Rooney, The Blackwater Lightship by Colm Tabine, Still Life by Sarah Winman, and Tin Man by Sarah Winman. Now let's jump into just a quick list of books and authors that I have read and really are not for me. So they don't factor into my list, but if they factored into yours, that would be totally fine. First, Jonathan Franzen. I've attempted to read 2 Jonathan Franzen books, DNF'd both of them. Otessa Moshfegh, I'm just not a fan. Haruki Murakami. Other than the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, I haven't really enjoyed his work, and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is outside of the time range for this list, so it's not going to factor in. The Overstory by Richard Powers, I DNF'd. I'm going to try again at some point for my Pulitzer project, but as it stands, I didn't finish it. 10th of December by George Saunders. I know a lot of people like that book. I thought it was just fine. Ali Smith is an author that a lot of people like, and I have really struggled with the books of hers that I have read. The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, I'm not a fan. I didn't finish it, and again, I'm going to have to try to finish for my Pulitzer Prize project at some point, but as it stands, I didn't finish it and did not like it. And A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I know that is a cilantro book. You either love it or you hate it. There's very little in between, and I am one of the people who hated it, for better or for worse. So, without further ado, let's get into what I say are the 25 best books of the last 25 years. I'm going to run through this part of the list alphabetically by author. And again, I'm going to do timestamps. If you want to jump to the top 5 or even the best, you can go ahead and do so. The first book is Call Me By Your Name by André Aciman. This was published in 2007. Quick note on years. I was really worried about recency bias, so I perhaps deliberately didn't include anything from 2022, but I kept a note of all of the years, and it is pretty spread out. So Call Me By Your Name by André Aciman was published in 2007. Incidentally, this was one of the first books that my husband Joel recommended to me. The fact that he hit it out of the park so well scored him a lot of points. Call Me By Your Name is a very queer novel about lust and the way first love can become like an obsession. I was a little disappointed that there weren't more outright queer books on this list, but, you like what you like, I guess. Every page of this book burns with desire, perfectly using the setting, a vacation home in Italy in the 1980s, to exaggerate the sense of passion in a temporary environment. To me, this is such a perfect book that I refused to read the sort of sequel, Find Me, especially after that book got wildly mixed reviews. But I do love Call Me By Your Name by André Aciman. Then we have The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. This is the only sci-fi or fantasy-leaning book on this list. It was published in 2020. This Australian novel goes to some wild and unexpected places with some details I won't go into here that really exacerbated my fear of the ocean and everything in it. And I don't want to go into it because I think knowing anything beyond the basic premise of this book could lessen your experience of it. Everything in the description of this book happens within the first 50 pages, allowing the story to unfold in very unexpected directions. It also has 2 fantastic female protagonists, and I will say no more. It's The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott, which was published in 2020. That takes us to something that might be a bit of a cheat, but I don't think so, and it's my list, so I get to make my own rules. Whose Names Are Unknown by Sanora Babb. This book was written in the 1930s, and that's why this feels like a bit of a cheat, but it was not published until 2004, which means it's eligible for this list, and I'm including it. Call it a cheat if you must. I don't care. Again, originally written in the late 1930s, the publishing deal to release Whose Names Are Unknown was canceled when The Grapes of Wrath became a massive success, making Babb's publisher too afraid of looking derivative. I go into Babb's unusual ties to Steinbeck's novel in my deep dive on The Grapes of Wrath. I will link it down below. Whose Names Are Unknown, which I actually liked better than The Grapes of Wrath, was finally published in 2004. And it is an extremely humane and empathetic book. It's the story of a family struggling to survive the Dust Bowl, ultimately moving to California for salvation, only to find continued struggle. I absolutely love this book, and through a quirk of publication, it is eligible for this list, so I can't not include it. It's a really great book. Now we have The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. This was published in 2000. An epic, sprawling Pulitzer Prize winner, the first of 5 Pulitzer books that will be on this list. This novel follows 2 cousins, Joe Kavalier and Sammy Clay, as they build towering success during the golden age of comic books. But their stories are tied up in larger, thornier issues like immigration, sexuality, and, most significantly, the United States during the build-up to entering World War II. It is a fascinating book, not just in the way it portrays how entertainment can be used to influence politics, and vice versa, but in the human story at the center of it all. Great book, Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, published in the year 2000. Then we have The Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich. This was published in 2008. In many ways, you could say that Louise Erdrich's best novel is actually her first, Love Medicine, which was published outside of the time frame we're looking at here. I think The Plague of Doves, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, is the high point of all the narrative threads Erdrich set in motion with her debut. Like many of her novels, this one has a terrible crime at its core, and it features a wide array of indelible characters, some with ties to Erdrich's other novels. It also heavily deals with injustice and community, and it can be surprisingly funny. I really love it. It's The Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich, published in 2008. That takes us to Matrix by Lauren Groff, published in 2021. The difficulty with a lot of recent publications is that you don't really know how well they're going to sit with you over time. I struggled with whether or not I think Matrix needs more time to prove itself, but ultimately, I love this book about a girl boss lesbian nun in the 12th century. I love how it unfolds, I love the voice of the protagonist, and I love how it talks about the role of women in history and how the importance of women is often erased or underestimated. It's the real deal, really fantastic. Matrix by Lauren Groff, published in 2021. That takes us to the first book that I don't actually own a copy of. It's Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, published in 2016. Homegoing had the spectacular misfortune of having all its thunder stolen by another novel that was published the same year, Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. Whitehead ate up book prizes, including the Pulitzer and critical citations, and Homegoing seemed poised to be forgotten. Thankfully, I've recently heard some people praise it, and I really hope that more people will discover it over time. The story begins with 2 sisters in the same place, 18th century Ghana. One sister is sold into slavery, and the other stays in Ghana. Every chapter of the book leaps ahead one generation, alternating between the descendants of each sister. In doing so, Gyasi manages to write a novel not just about the lasting implications of slavery in the United States, but in the world at large. I think it's absolutely brilliant, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it to you. Then we have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 2005. This is something of a cilantro book, so your mileage may vary. I love it. The existence of a film adaptation and general discourse around the book, and the fact that Kazuo Ishiguro eventually went on to win a Nobel Prize for Literature, have largely spoiled what this book is actually about. So I encourage you to go into this book as blind as you can and let the direction of the novel surprise and haunt you. All you need to know is that it follows 3 students at a mysterious boarding school. The narrative is a bit slow and meandering, but to me, it mimics the way memory ebbs and flows, and how stories are frequently told with digressions and asides. And when it gets to the end, heartbreak. It's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 2005. Now we get to The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fannone Jeffers, published in 2021. Despite the proximity of this book's publication date, I knew it was going to appear on this list the moment I decided to create it. What Jeffers achieves with this novel, which she refers to as a kitchen table epic, is frankly astonishing. It's a novel about the history of a family and the history of a place and how those two things are tied together. It's also the story of a young Black woman growing up and coming into her own power and agency. It is one of the best written books I have ever read. It's a chunky guy, but it's fantastic, and I would encourage you to read it if you have not already. Now we have War Trash by Ha Jin. This was published in 2004. This is probably one of the lesser known books I have on this list, and I really hope that more people discover it. My elevator pitch is that it's like The Things They Carried, but set among Chinese soldiers held in an American prisoner of war camp during the Korean War. It's a very gritty war is hell novel that also heavily deals with human nature. It is compelling, it is difficult, and it would be well worth your time. That is War Trash by Ha Jin, published in 2004. It was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist, but it did not win. Speaking of Pulitzer Prize finalists, we have Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson, published in 2011. Although it was originally published in a 2002 issue of the Paris Review. It was published as a novella in 2011, and it probably nearly won the Pulitzer Prize. Again, it was a finalist, but that was the year in which no winner was selected out of the three finalists. I have a whole video about it. I'll link it down below. Johnson is mostly known for his electrifying story collection, Jesus' Son, or his really hefty novel, Tree of Smoke, but it's this one for me. It packs a mean punch in a small package, deftly telling a story about grief, the American West, and the transformative power of time. I love it. It's a tiny little thing, so you could easily fit it in, and I would encourage you to do so. Now we have Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, published in 2021. So speaking of big punches that come in a small package, it's another 2021 publication. It turns out 2021 was a good year for books. This one is an Irish novella about a man faced with a difficult decision in 1985. He can either do the right thing against an insurmountable enemy, or he can turn a blind eye and let injustice continue. It is a spectacular short novel. It was the shortest book ever shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It did not ultimately win. I know a lot of people also love Foster by Claire Keegan. To me, it's Small Things Like These. Foster is a great book. I have it right here. But for me, it's Small Things Like These. That takes us to The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, published in 1998. Thank goodness this book barely made it into the time period for this video, because I love everything about this book. The whole last year has been great for me because I have had so many opportunities to tell people about how much I love The Poisonwood Bible, as Demon Copperhead had its awards run and critical run last year and this year. This book begins in 1959 and follows a white American family as they arrive in what was then the Belgian Congo to do missionary work. They quickly learn that they are wildly out of their element. It is a beautiful novel, and I love it. For the record, will add that Demon Copperhead was on my long list for this, but I decided I needed to give it a little more time to sit before I put it in such lofty company. But it was one of the painful cuts that I made before finalizing this list. So there you go. Now we have Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri, published in 1999. This is one of my all-time favorite short story collections. If you have ever read anything by Jhumpa Lahiri, you know that her writing is gorgeous. That is true even in her debut. This was her first published book, and she won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction for it. These stories are about immigration and the divides that form in its wake, not just between two geographic areas, but also between cultures and people. It is eloquent, it is quiet, it is very powerful, and it's very good. It's just very good. I will leave it at that. That's Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri, published in 1999. And then we come to another book that I don't actually have a copy of. It's Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, published in 2009. Now, I admit, I almost included the sequel to this book, Bring Up the Bodies, instead. That one is my favorite book in Mantel's landmark trilogy about Thomas Cromwell. It's shorter, it's sharper, it's less frustrating to read. However, as I thought about it, I realized that Bring Up the Bodies is only able to be short and sharp because it benefits from the foundation Mantell lays with Wolf Hall. You can certainly appreciate Bring Up the Bodies if you haven't read Wolf Hall, but the payoff is better if you read them in order. And the truth is, as much as I complain that Wolf Hall is a dense read, it is, I have been thinking about it ever since I read it. It stays with you. So ultimately, I chose Wolf Hall for the list, and then Bring Up the Bodies, spoiler alert, was one of the tough cuts that I made right at the end in order to finalize a list and keep it at 25. Here's The Good Lord Bird by James McBride, published in 2013. This is a wild read that is funny and insightful. It follows a young enslaved boy pretending to be a girl in order to survive the bloody conflicts that have broken out in the Kansas Territory in 1856. Our protagonist is forced to follow along with the legendary and real-life abolitionist John Brown, ultimately leading to the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, a catalyst for the Civil War. So this is a novel about history and slavery and racism, but it's also very much about identity, especially since our protagonist has assumed another identity in order to survive. In certain ways, it is also about how racism and enslavement alienate you from yourself. It is very powerful. I have become a lifelong fan of James McBride for this book alone. Very well worth your time if you have not read it already. Now we get to Cormac McCarthy, the sort of inspiration for this whole list, and The Road. This was published in 2006. Interestingly, the original list from the New York Times was published only a few months before The Road was released. This ultimately won Cormac McCarthy a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It was one of the best reviewed books of that decade. So it's likely that if the Times list had been published a year or two later, this book would have been more competitive than Blood Meridian. But over the last 10 years, the pendulum has swung back to Blood Meridian. It's just an interesting evolution and a really great case in point for how enthusiasm can change over time. The Road is a tremendous and violent book either way, following a father and a son as they try to survive the tatters of civilization. Again, from 2006, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, a Pulitzer Prize winner. Now we get to A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza, published in 2018. This is an unabashedly personal choice for me. This is a novel about a fractured family that hit me in all the feels. I felt emotionally devastated when it was over, in the best possible way. And then I was supposed to just go on with my life as if everything was fine. It was not fine. I was a mess, and I had to work. It was awful. The inciting incident for this book is that an estranged brother and son is invited to his sister's wedding, and he agrees to attend. What unfolds is a stunning story about family, immigration, religion, parenthood, and the ways small fractures left unattended can ultimately cause huge, impassable divides. I love this book. I can't wait to see what Fatima Farheen Mirza does next, because this was her debut and it's that good. Again, it was published in 2018 and I highly recommend it. I highly recommend all of these books, but I'm going to keep saying it, probably. Now we get to my beloved, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Philyaw, published in 2020. You knew my beloved was going to be on this list somewhere, right? 2020 was a cursed year for the world thanks to the pandemic, but it gave us two books on this list. This one is a landmark short story collection for me. It follows the inner lives of Black women facing the expectations that society has foisted upon them and confronting the ways in which those expectations can fly in the face of their own wants and desires. It is very much about religion, as you can tell from the title, but its message goes much further than just that, I think. Again, published in 2020, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Philyaw, my beloved. That takes us to Close Range, Wyoming Stories by Annie Proulx, published in 1999. This short story collection is probably most famous for giving us Brokeback Mountain, but don't sleep on the rest of the stories. Annie Proulx is a phenomenal writer, and in my opinion, no book shows off her skill better than this one. Yes, not even The Shipping News, which is the book that won her a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. There is a passage in the first story, The Half-Skinned Steer, that implanted itself in my brain. It's that good. Prue's writing is blunt, sparse, and powerful. I highly recommend Close Range if you have not read it for yourself. Now we have a really interesting book for this list. Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. This was published in 2004. Now, when Gilead won the Pulitzer Prize after it was published, I read it, and I thought it was fine. I also read Housekeeping, which was, at the time, the only other book that Robinson had published. Significantly, part of the lore of Gilead at the time was that it was Robinson's first novel in 24 years. She has since published many others, but at the time, it was only those two. And since I was in my early 20s at the time, Housekeeping was much more my speed, because it's a coming-of-age novel. Over time, however, Gilead proved to have really burrowed into my psyche. It still lives in my mind and heart, and as I worked through my 30s and experienced fatherhood in untraditional ways, I kept thinking about Gilead. When I started my Pulitzer Prize project, this was one of the books I was most excited to reread. I had lost or gotten rid of my copy of the book, so I went to a bookstore to pick up a replacement. I read the first page of the book and found myself moved to tears right there in the middle of the bookstore. It was entirely unexpected, and I think it just goes to show that sometimes your opinion of a book changes over time. Like in my early 20s, what did I know about aging and dying and fatherhood? Now I know a whole lot more about it. And it's a good, fascinating thing that you and your taste and your understanding of things evolves over time. And that has been my experience of Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, again, published in 2004. Now we have Empire Falls by Richard Russo, published in 2001. This is probably one of the quietest, most low-key books on this list. I read it after it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and I liked it, but I don't think I expected it to live with me 20 years later. Sometimes you just can't predict the books that will stay with you. First of all, Richard Russo is a first-rate storyteller who excels at blue-collar stories about America moving away from the boomer era. I'm due for a reread at this point, but one of the things I have enjoyed about Russo's writing is that he approaches the changing face of America with nostalgia, but without fixation. You know, sometimes you get that sense of people who long for past and want it to be like that, but he has a much more complicated relationship. He sees the ways the past was complicated and maybe bad, and how progress can actually be good. Perhaps the story of Miles Roby, who has been running the Empire Grill for 20 years and is finding ways to reinvigorate his business, is the best example of Russo's nostalgia at work. You can miss times gone by even as you keep working for the future. That is Empire Falls by Richard Russo, published in 2001. Now we have All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews, published in 2014. It is exceedingly hard for a book to make me cry and for a book to make me laugh out loud, and All My Puny Sorrows did both, repeatedly. This is a story inspired by Toews' real life and relationship with her sister, which makes it even more heartbreaking. It follows two sisters, one a world-famous pianist who is determined to end her life, and the other unsure if the best way to help her sister is to convince her to live or to let her go. It sounds awful, and it is to a degree, but it is also deeply funny and moving. I am a lifelong devotee of Miriam Toews for this novel alone, and again, it was published in 2014. Now we get to Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward, published in 2017. Now, my favorite Jesmyn Ward novel remains Salvage the Bones, because its raw power has not left me since I finished it. But I have to admit that the overall best book we've gotten from Ward, so far at least, is Sing Unburied Sing, a novel that calls back to the best work of William Faulkner. It is also a novel about the messy heart and soul of America, revealed through the story of a family traveling through Mississippi and reckoning with a deep history of violence that still holds power today. It is powerful, visceral stuff that is Sing Unburied Sing, published in 2017. Now, the final book in my top 25 is The Yield by Tara June Winch, published in 2019. This is one of only 2 books on this list that did not originate in North America or Europe, and both of them came from Australia. It's just an interesting fact for you. So this is an Australian novel that feels every bit as relevant or urgent to an American reader because it deals with the ways Indigenous people have been dispossessed, displaced, disenfranchised, and more. It is also a celebration of language and ways of keeping your heritage alive. It's also the story of a complicated family. And I always love that. That is The Yield by Tara June Winch, published in 2019. Now, let's briefly cover some near misses, books that I really struggled with whether or not to include on this list, and ultimately they did not make the cut because I just had to get it down to 25. Again, I originally included Hilary Mantel's Bring Up the Bodies, Jessamine Ward's Salvage the Bones, and Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which would have given all 3 of those authors 2 slots on the list. I ultimately decided to drop Bring Up the Bodies in favor of Wolf Hall for the reasons I noted earlier. I also decided to allow Demon Copperhead more time to sit with me before running the risk of overstating my love for that book. And Salvage the Bones was one of my final painful cuts to make my arbitrary decision to include 25 books to match 25 years. The other books that were particularly painful cuts were Douglas Stewart's Shuggie Bain, Benjamin Alire-Sainz's Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, and Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet. Perhaps I made a bit of an overcorrection worrying about recency bias in creating this list, but as hard as it was to lose some of these books, I do stand by the decision. I do think this is a very solid top 25. Now, let's get to my top 5 out of this list of 25 books. Creating a list of 25 was difficult enough. I hope you can imagine how hard it was to narrow it down even further to only 5 books. Then picking a single winner out of all of that was madness. It was just madness. But here are the books I selected to round out my top 5 fiction books of the last 25 years, and I'm going to run through them alphabetically by author. The first one is The Plague of Doves by Louise Erdrich, again published in 2008. I seriously debated between this one and The Yield by Tara June Winch, and then I noticed that through sheer coincidence, I was pitting 2 books about the Indigenous experience against each other. Just a weird, funny thing that happened totally coincidentally. Ultimately, my heart belongs to Louise Erdrich, so I went with The Plague of Doves, the first book in my top 5 from this list. Then, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 2005. This book just haunts me. If you want to be punny about it, I'm never going to let it go. There, I said it, and I'm not sorry. Not sorry at all. Then, The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, published in 1998. Including this one in the top 5 was a no-brainer. It is one of my all-time favorites. Then, we have Close Range Wyoming Stories by Annie Proulx, published in 1999. Quite simply, I think this is one of the best short story collections ever written, and I think it is the best showcase of the incredible and unique power that Annie Proulx has as a writer. The final book in my top 5 is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, published in 2004. Robinson's writing in this book and its profound humanity have had the most unexpected hold on me of any book on this list. Let's get to the big moment. The best book in fiction from the last 25 years, according to me. I said that it was difficult picking a winner, and it was, but the truth is that I very quickly knew my top 2 contenders. For me, it came down to The Poisonwood Bible and Gilead. I knew they were my top 2 contenders from the moment I decided to make this list. The only question was which book was going to come out on top. Both novels took turns in first place at varying points in the roughly 3 weeks that I have been working on this list and paring it down and preparing thoughts and all of that. Even today, as I am finalizing the list, I keep waffling back and forth between the two books. I think the reason it's so difficult is that I haven't reread Gilead yet. And to be fair, I haven't reread the Poisonwood Bible yet either. Without those rereads, I'm going off of my first impressions. And as I noted, I think I was too young for Gilead the first time around. My appreciation for Gilead has really grown enormously over time. Without rereading them, I feel stuck between my personal choice, the Poisonwood Bible, and what I think is objectively the best book on the list. Not to mention the one that I think I might prefer if I were to read it now, Gilead. And although I might have a different answer if you ask me again tomorrow, I think for right now, I have to side with the book that I think is objectively the best. Therefore, I declare that for me, the best fiction book of the last 25 years is Marilynne Robinson's Gilead. And for the record, just to get into the rest of the list, I think my third place finisher would have been Never Let Me Go, fourth place would have been Close Range, and fifth would have been The Plague of Doves. This is a little bit unexpected. Again, it's weird to say that it's unexpected because I knew what the top two books were. But it seemed obvious at the time that, well, of course it's going to be the Poisonwood Bible, because that's a book that I have loved for a very long time, and I've had a more complicated history with Gilead. So this has been an unexpected and fun journey, and I've been working on this post for 3 weeks at this point. So a lot of time and thought and care has gone into this, perhaps too much. And it's been an unexpected journey, and it's gotten me even more excited to reread Gilead. I really think it's a fantastic book. I think Marilynne Robinson is one of the most beautiful writers we have working in the moment. And I'm really excited to read more of her books because, again, she has published a lot more since Gilead, and I'm looking forward to those. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts about this. And again, we're going 1998 through to the present. Please double check, because there were some books that I thought would be in this window and they weren't. They were actually outside it. So if you have a book that was published within that window, let me know what you think is the best and what would be on your top list. And if you have a channel, I would encourage you, do your own version of this video, tag me, and I would be really curious to see what is on it. And again, just let me know what you think in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time. This was a very fun journey for me, despite all of the work that went into it. And it was interesting. So thank you for your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.